In 1993, Rubbermaid was practically invincible. It was crowned the most admired company in America, beating out corporate titans like Coca-Cola and Disney. It was a Wall Street darling with an absolute stranglehold on American homes. Yet just 1 decade later, the massive machines in Wooster, Ohio, fell dead silent. Over 1,000 American workers were suddenly locked out, and an 80-year-old manufacturing legacy was completely sold off for parts. How did an unstoppable industrial juggernaut get absolutely annihilated by a standoff over the price of a single plastic trash can? Freight trains moved steadily through Wayne County, Ohio, in the autumn of 1920. They carried coal and raw industrial materials beneath overcast skies, cutting through the heavy midwestern humidity that routinely settled over the region. The city of Wooster sat precisely in the path of this expanding American supply chain. It was an era defined by a rapid transition from agricultural reliance to mechanical production, and the local landscape was quickly being permanently altered by brick, steel, and steam. Wooster was steadily developing into a classic Midwestern manufacturing hub, driven by access to vast railway networks and a highly reliable local labor force accustomed to grueling physical work. Within this environment of soot and heavy industry, the Wooster Rubber Company was incorporated. The initial operations of the factory were entirely unremarkable in the broader context of American manufacturing. The facility was designed to produce simple consumer goods, primarily focusing on toy balloons, under the brand name Sunshine. The manufacturing floor was a harsh environment characterized by the persistent smell of sulfur and the rhythmic, deafening mechanical thud of early milling machines. Raw rubber had to be broken down, compounded with chemical accelerators, and molded under extreme heat. The men who worked the early lines in Wooster performed relentless manual labor, operating heavy steel rollers and tending to vulcanizing ovens that pushed the temperature of the factory floor to punishing extremes during the summer months. The company operated as a modest economic engine for the city. It provided steady wages and established a foundational understanding of rubber compounding within the local workforce. For over a decade, the factory sustained itself on minor consumer novelty items, surviving the economic turbulence of the early 1930s by maintaining strict operational efficiency. The systems of production in Wooster were highly functional, but fundamentally limited by the scope of their product line. Hundreds of miles away, an entirely separate economic system was being evaluated by a man named James Caldwell. The American household was undergoing a profound structural shift. The rapid expansion of the middle class and the modernization of residential architecture meant that domestic spaces were becoming highly organized environments. However, the tools utilized to maintain these spaces remained stubbornly archaic. Kitchens and living areas were cleaned using heavy, rigid implements made of tin, wood, and brittle iron. These materials were prone to rust, they splintered, and they inflicted daily damage on modern linoleum floors and ceramic surfaces. Caldwell observed this inefficiency and identified a critical gap in the consumer market. The objective was not to build a global corporate empire. The objective was strictly functional. Caldwell sought to engineer a tool that could absorb impact, resist chemical corrosion, and eliminate the acoustic harshness of metal scraping against hardwood. He drafted the design for a simple, seamless rubber dustpan. It was an innovation rooted entirely in utilitarian logic. A flexible rubber edge would maintain flush contact with uneven floorboards, ensuring total collection of debris, while the resilient body of the pan would withstand years of daily physical impact without structural failure. To bring this concept to the market, Caldwell established a small enterprise, branding the utilitarian product line under the name Rubbermaid. He began localized production and direct consumer distribution in New England. The structural integrity of the seamless rubber dustpan proved immediately successful among American housewives who recognized the distinct operational advantage over traditional tin models. The product practically eliminated the need for continuous replacement. The physical properties of molded rubber inherently established a deep, functional trust between the manufacturer and the consumer. However, Caldwell quickly encountered a severe logistical ceiling. His operation possessed the conceptual framework and the distribution strategy, but it entirely lacked the industrial infrastructure required to scale production. The demand for the unbreakable dustpan rapidly outpaced the capacity of his initial manufacturing setup. To expand, the system required an established factory floor, heavy milling equipment, and a labor force already trained in the volatile chemistry of rubber vulcanization. In 1934, these two distinct entities intersected. The operational needs of Caldwell perfectly aligned with the latent manufacturing capacity of the Wooster Rubber Company. The leadership in Ohio recognized the long-term economic viability of transitioning away from novelty balloons and dedicating their heavy machinery to highly durable, essential household goods. A formal merger was executed, fusing Caldwell's practical design philosophy with the established industrial machinery of Wayne County. This consolidation permanently altered the trajectory of the Wooster facility. The factory floor was systematically overhauled. The machinery previously calibrated for thin, disposable rubber was retooled to cast thick, heavy-duty molds. The production lines were optimized for mass volume. Freight trains arriving in Wooster now delivered massive quantities of raw rubber bales and sulfur compounds, specifically allocated for domestic tools. The local labor force was retrained to manage larger molding presses and implement stricter quality control measures, ensuring that every dustpan, drainboard mat, and soap dish leaving the loading docks maintained uniform structural integrity. The integration of the Rubbermaid product line transformed the Wooster Rubber Company from a regional novelty manufacturer into an essential component of the American domestic economy. The factory began producing a comprehensive catalog of household implements designed specifically to silence the kitchen and protect residential surfaces. The strategy was slow, methodical, and entirely grounded in physical utility. There were no aggressive corporate acquisitions or highly leveraged financial maneuvers. The growth of the factory was driven exclusively by the sustained physical output of its local workforce and the undeniable durability of the material they molded. By the late 1930s, the sprawling brick facility in Ohio had deeply entrenched itself into the economic bedrock of the city. The operational shifts within the plant dictated the rhythm of the surrounding neighborhoods. Shift whistles governed the movement of traffic across town, and the reliable wages generated by the steady national demand for rubber goods stabilized the local economy during a period of broader national uncertainty. The company and the community formed a highly symbiotic system. The town provided the generational muscle required to operate the heavy presses, and the factory provided the financial foundation that built local schools, maintained roads, and funded civic infrastructure. The Wooster plant was no longer just a collection of brick buildings and steam valves. It had evolved into a massive, highly tuned industrial machine, fully dedicated to the concept that practical, unbreakable tools were the cornerstone of modern American life. The early decades of the company established an operational discipline that would define its future. They had successfully conquered the mechanics of natural and synthetic rubber, building a localized empire entirely on the promise of durability. The machines were heavy, the labor was intense, and the output was incredibly consistent. The foundation was securely poured, and the systems were fully operational, waiting only for the technological catalyst that would soon push the factory from a successful domestic manufacturer into an unprecedented global behemoth. The cessation of global conflict in 1945 initiated a profound reallocation of American industrial capacity. For nearly half a decade, the raw materials required for domestic manufacturing had been strictly diverted to the military supply chain. Natural rubber had been heavily rationed, forcing the engineers in Wayne County to navigate severe supply shortages just to maintain baseline operations. However, the constraints of the war effort had simultaneously accelerated a quiet revolution in chemical engineering. Government-funded laboratories and chemical conglomerates had spent the war developing synthetic alternatives to natural resources. By the time the industrial economy returned to a peacetime footing, the fundamental building blocks of manufacturing had been permanently altered. The era of heavy vulcanized rubber was drawing to a close, and the age of synthetic polymers had arrived. The leadership at the Wooster facility recognized that the post-war market would not be won by the materials of the past. The physical limitations of rubber, its weight, its opaque finish, and its susceptibility to degradation over time, made it unsuited for a rapidly modernizing society. The future of the company relied on adapting its heavy industrial infrastructure to process an entirely new class of raw materials. They began experimenting with early formulations of polyethylene and polystyrene. These new thermoplastic polymers offered unprecedented manufacturing advantages. They could be melted down, injected into highly complex steel molds, and cooled into rigid or flexible shapes in a fraction of the time required by traditional rubber vulcanization. This transition fundamentally altered the ecosystem of the Wooster factory floor. The secondary consequences of this chemical shift fell heavily upon the local workforce. Generations of men who had built their livelihoods wrestling with the intense heat, sulfurous fumes, and heavy mechanical rollers of rubber production were suddenly required to learn a new type of industrial alchemy. The sensory environment of the plant transformed. The dense, choking smell of curing rubber was gradually replaced by the sharp, synthetic odor of heated resin. The brutal physical labor of manually prying heavy rubber goods from cast iron molds was phased out by the rhythmic, automated sequencing of massive injection molding machines. The workforce had to adapt from brute force to mechanical precision, managing highly pressurized systems where a fluctuation of a few degrees could compromise an entire production run. As the factory mastered these new polymers, the company officially consolidated its identity. Despite transitioning rapidly away from its foundational material, the enterprise fully adopted the Rubbermaid moniker across its expanding catalog. The name had already established a deep reservoir of consumer trust, based on the indestructible dust pans and drainboard mats of the 1930s. Carrying that legacy forward into the plastic age was a calculated decision to signal durability in an unproven material market. Beyond the factory walls, the demographic and architectural landscape of the United States was shifting at an unprecedented velocity. The return of millions of servicemen triggered a massive housing boom, characterized by the rapid expansion of suburban tracts across the American periphery. These new homes represented a radical departure from pre-war domestic architecture. The modern suburban kitchen was designed as a highly efficient, mechanized command center. It featured continuous Formica countertops, easy-to-clean linoleum floors, and most importantly, large electric refrigerators. This new domestic infrastructure created an immediate, desperate need for systematic organization. The American housewife was no longer simply maintaining a home. She was managing an inventory. The modern electric refrigerator allowed for the bulk purchasing and long-term preservation of perishable food, but it lacked internal modularity. Traditional storage methods, utilizing heavy glass jars, tin canisters, and wax paper, were inefficient, fragile, and difficult to manage. The market demanded a solution that was lightweight, sanitary, and structurally resilient. Rubbermaid met this exact demographic moment with a tidal wave of newly engineered plastic products. The injection molding technology allowed the Wooster factory to produce an endless variety of standardized, stackable containers with airtight seals. Furthermore, the chemical nature of the plastics allowed for the introduction of vibrant, uniform pigments. The factory began producing storage solutions in cheerful hues that perfectly matched the modern appliances of the era. The product line evolved from purely utilitarian cleaning implements into highly visible components of the domestic aesthetic. However, the explosive demand for household plastics inevitably attracted a flood of opportunistic manufacturers. By the early 1950s, the market was heavily saturated with cheap, hastily produced plastic goods. These early competitors utilized low-grade, highly brittle polymers to ruthlessly undercut prices. For a brief period, the American consumer was inundated with generic plastic bowls that shattered when dropped, and storage containers that warped and melted when exposed to the heat of modern dishwashers. A significant consumer backlash began to build against the very concept of plastic, which was rapidly gaining a reputation as a cheap, disposable, and ultimately unreliable material. This environment of eroding consumer confidence forced a climactic internal reckoning at the Wooster headquarters. The executive leadership faced immense financial pressure to degrade their own material quality to compete with the influx of cheap, lightweight plastic flooding the retail shelves. The decision they made at this juncture would dictate the survival of the entire enterprise. In a definitive pivot away from the industry trend, Rubbermaid chose to completely ignore the race to the bottom. They mandated that their injection molding lines would only process premium, high-density polyethylene and highly resilient compounds. This strategic refusal to compromise structural integrity required massive capital investment in heavier steel molds and significantly increased the base cost of their raw resin. It was a high-stakes gamble that relied entirely on the belief that the American consumer would eventually calculate the long-term cost of replacing shattered generic plastics. The Wooster factory implemented rigorous, systematic stress testing on the production floor. Products were subjected to severe temperature fluctuations and extreme impact drops to ensure they met a standard of near indestructibility before being loaded onto the outbound freight trains. The strategy was brutally effective. While early competitors saw their brittle products rejected by frustrated consumers, Rubbermaid goods survived the harsh realities of the modern kitchen. They did not warp in boiling water. They did not shatter when dropped onto concrete patios, and their airtight seals did not degrade over time. By holding the line on material quality during a period of intense price degradation, Rubbermaid completely wiped out the inferior competition. They emerged from the early plastic boom not merely as a survivor, but as an absolute monopoly on consumer trust. The physical supremacy of their products effectively erased the stigma of cheap plastic from the minds of the American public. To accommodate the resulting surge in national demand, the Wooster complex began a phase of aggressive, exponential physical expansion. New warehouses were erected, more injection molding machines were purchased, and the local workforce swelled to unprecedented numbers. The material breakthrough had been fully realized, transforming a regional manufacturer into an unavoidable presence in the American home, and setting the stage for an era of industrial dominance that Wayne County had never before witnessed. The decisive victory in the post-war materials market triggered a physical metamorphosis in Wayne County. To meet the escalating national demand for high-density polyethylene products, the original brick structures of the Wooster Rubber Company were rapidly enveloped by modern industrial architecture. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, construction crews systematically converted surrounding midwestern acreage into a sprawling, interconnected manufacturing complex. The facility expanded into millions of square feet of dedicated industrial space, becoming a dominant geographical feature of the Ohio landscape. The sheer physical footprint of the plant evolved to reflect its absolute market dominance. Inside the massive new steel-framed warehouses, the scale of operation reached unprecedented levels. The transition from manual rubber molding to mechanized plastic injection required the installation of colossal industrial machinery. Hundreds of giant injection molding presses were bolted directly to reinforced concrete floors. These machines, many standing 2 stories tall, and exerting thousands of tons of clamping pressure, operated in a continuous, unyielding rhythm. The factory floor became a landscape of continuous heavy motion. The sensory environment was characterized by the deafening hiss of hydraulic pistons, the deep mechanical thuds of heavy steel molds closing, and the constant, vibrating hum of massive cooling fans. Raw plastic resin arrived via dedicated freight spurs in modified hopper cars. This material was vacuumed into towering aluminum silos that stood like sentinels over the facility, feeding a complex network of pneumatic tubes that delivered the resin directly to the heated hoppers of the individual presses. To process this immense volume of raw material, the operation shifted from standard workday shifts to a relentless 24-hour cycle, running 7 days a week without interruption. As the physical footprint of the factory expanded, its economic gravity consumed the surrounding area. The corporate entity effectively absorbed the municipal identity of Wooster. The relationship between the manufacturer and the municipality evolved from mere geographic proximity into a deeply entrenched, symbiotic ecosystem. The enormous tax revenue generated by the continuous production cycle flowed directly into the local infrastructure. The municipal grid of Wayne County was upgraded, expanded, and maintained largely through the industrial output of the massive plant. Corporate philanthropy funded the construction of new hospital wings, underwrote extensive public park systems, and built modern educational facilities. For the residents of Wooster, the factory ceased to be merely an employer and became the central organizing principle of local life. The shift whistles of the factory, echoing across the valley every 8 hours, dictated the rhythm of local traffic, the operating hours of downtown diners, and the daily routine of domestic life. Local businesses thrived almost entirely on the secondary economic momentum generated by the massive payroll. Employment at the sprawling complex was no longer viewed as transient or expendable labor. It had become a generational inheritance. Fathers trained sons on the intricacies of operating the heavy hydraulic presses, while entire families staffed the massive shipping and receiving departments. The highly specialized knowledge required to maintain and repair the complex steel molds was passed down through local apprenticeships. The immense wealth generated by the sale of premium plastic goods across the North American continent was systematically converted into reliable midwestern middle-class stability, complete with robust pensions and comprehensive healthcare benefits. This era of unchecked expansion and profound economic security forged a distinct psychology among the workforce. A fierce, almost impenetrable pride took root within the community. The thousands of men and women who operated the towering machines and managed the endless logistics networks recognized the sheer physical scale of their creation. They were producing millions of flawless, highly durable units every single month, supplying virtually every major retail outlet in the United States. Walking onto the massive, vibrating factory floor, surrounded by millions of dollars of heavy industrial equipment, imparted a profound sense of permanence. The workforce developed a collective, unshakable belief in their own invincibility. They genuinely believed that the craftsmanship they applied to the intricate steel molds and the sheer, overwhelming physical mass of the Wooster complex made them fundamentally untouchable. The factory was viewed not as a vulnerable, calculating business enterprise, but as an enduring American institution, as permanent as the freight rail lines that fed it. The complex had weathered the difficult transition from rubber to plastic. It had decisively crushed early inferior competitors, and it had built a thriving, wealthy city around its reinforced walls. In the minds of the Wayne County labor force, their specialized mechanical knowledge and the colossal infrastructure they commanded insulated them entirely from external economic forces. They were the undisputed masters of an empire built on unbreakable plastic. However, the creation of such a massive industrial behemoth inherently altered the nature of the operation, setting the stage for a critical shift in power. By the late 1970s, the sheer volume of production began to generate its own immense gravitational pull, forcing a structural change in how the enterprise was managed. The logistics of moving thousands of tons of volatile resin and shipping millions of finished products daily required a level of coordination that rapidly surpassed human intuition. To maintain the relentless pace and manage the staggering inventory, the company was forced to introduce early mainframe computing and advanced logistical tracking systems. This integration of algorithmic management marked a quiet but fundamental turning point on the factory floor. The control of the manufacturing process began to shift away from the seasoned intuition of the floor managers and into the domain of mathematical efficiency. The colossal machines, originally installed to serve the ambitions of the local workforce, now began to dictate the pace of human labor. The workers, once the proud operators of the heavy equipment, were increasingly required to synchronize their physical movements to the unyielding, optimized output of the injection molders. The massive scale of the Wooster complex, which had been the source of the community's immense pride and perceived invincibility, had subtly transformed the factory into a rigid, highly complex machine. The institution had grown so large that it required perfect, uninterrupted volume simply to sustain its own mass. The fortress of American manufacturing had been built, and the community was thriving, but the operational stakes had been permanently raised. The company was no longer just producing household goods. It was feeding a behemoth that could never be allowed to slow down, paving the way for a new era of aggressive corporate management that would prioritize scale above all else. By the dawn of the 1980s, the massive injection molding complex in Wayne County was operating with algorithmic precision. The physical infrastructure was vast, and the local workforce was deeply entrenched in the continuous production cycle. However, the financial trajectory of the company remained conservative. Rubbermaid was universally respected as a reliable, high-quality manufacturer, but it was not yet viewed as an aggressive corporate powerhouse. The enterprise was generating steady, predictable revenue, which in the eyes of modern Wall Street was no longer sufficient. The financial markets demanded exponential growth. This corporate pressure necessitated a fundamental shift in leadership. In 1980, the company installed a new executive commander named Stanley Galt. Galt did not arrive from the factory floor. His background was rooted in the highly aggressive, hyper-competitive environment of massive corporate conglomerates. His specific function was to take the immense, sleeping industrial capacity of the Wooster facility and weaponize it for maximum financial yield. He understood that the company had successfully conquered the American kitchen, but to satisfy the relentless demands of the stock market, the enterprise had to colonize the rest of the American property. Under this new executive directive, the strategic focus of the company pivoted sharply away from its mid-century domestic roots. The engineering teams were ordered to look beyond food storage and cleaning supplies. They targeted the garage, the backyard, the workshop, and the commercial janitorial sector. The heavy steel molds in Ohio were rapidly retooled to produce massive, high-density polyethylene structures. The factory began extruding heavy-duty toolboxes, indestructible outdoor refuse containers, weather-resistant mailboxes, and eventually, entire freestanding utility sheds. The sheer tonnage of raw plastic resin flowing through the pneumatic tubes of the Wooster complex doubled and then doubled again. To force this unprecedented expansion, executive leadership instituted a brutal, uncompromising corporate mandate. It became known as the quota. To maintain their newly aggressive stance on Wall Street, the company committed to introducing one entirely new product to the consumer market every single day. 365 new products a year, continuously, without interruption. This mandate fundamentally altered the internal operational reality of the enterprise. Innovation was no longer a methodical, thoughtful process driven by consumer need. It was forcefully industrialized. The secondary consequences of this directive fell immediately upon the engineering departments and the tool ND makers deep within the Wooster facility. The timeline from initial concept to physical production was violently compressed. Designing a new product was only the theoretical beginning. The physical reality of the quota required the engineers to perfectly calculate the thermal dynamics of the plastic resin for each new shape. They had to design and machine massive multi-ton steel molds capable of withstanding the immense clamping pressure of the hydraulic presses. A microscopic error in the steel tooling could result in structural weaknesses or aesthetic deformities in the final plastic unit. For the specialized mold makers, the pride of patient craftsmanship was entirely replaced by the relentless, suffocating pressure of a ticking corporate clock. They were trapped in an endless cycle of prototyping, testing, and cutting new steel, forced to feed a corporate machine that demanded a new physical artifact every 24 hours. Despite the intense internal pressure, the external results were nothing short of spectacular. The implementation of the daily quota triggered a financial explosion. Throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s, Rubbermaid achieved total, undeniable market saturation. The physical output of the Wayne County factory found its way into virtually every commercial space and residential property in the country. Statistical analysis from the era revealed that the average American household possessed at least a half-dozen distinct Rubbermaid products. The financial metrics of the company became staggering. Profit margins swelled as the highly optimized factory pumped out millions of premium-priced units. The stock value split repeatedly, generating immense wealth for corporate shareholders and solidifying the company as a darling of the financial sector. The ultimate validation of this aggressive hyperscale strategy arrived in 1993, when Fortune magazine officially crowned Rubbermaid as the most admired company in the United States. They had surpassed untouchable corporate titans like Coca-Cola and Disney. To the outside observer, the manufacturing empire was completely invincible, operating at a level of industrial supremacy that seemed permanent. However, the sheer velocity of this success was actively engineering a massive structural vulnerability. The climactic realization of the golden age was a matter of simple spatial logistics. By strictly adhering to the daily product quota, the company had bloated its catalog to include thousands of distinct, active items, ranging from tiny spatula handles to massive outdoor storage units. The physical volume of the inventory pouring out of the loading docks in Ohio was incomprehensible. Traditional American retail infrastructure was entirely unequipped to handle this output. Local hardware stores, independent pharmacies, and mid-sized regional supermarkets simply did not possess the square footage required to stock the rapidly expanding Rubbermaid catalog. To keep the factory machines running and to sustain the soaring stock price, the inventory had to be moved continuously. The executives realized that their magnificent industrial machine had outgrown the very retail ecosystem that had nurtured it. To absorb the millions of units produced every month, the company was forced to seek out new distribution channels. They needed partners with cavernous, warehouse-style retail spaces and massive national logistics networks. The golden age of hyperscale had pushed the company to the absolute peak of American manufacturing, but it had also forced them into a corner. They had scaled so aggressively that their survival now depended entirely on securing shelf space within the rapidly expanding empires of the big-box mega retailers. The immense power of the Wayne County behemoth was about to be tethered directly to a new breed of corporate distributor, setting the stage for a catastrophic shift in leverage. The pristine, brightly colored storage containers lining the shelves of American department stores throughout the early 1990s presented an image of immaculate domestic order. The corporate narrative celebrated by financial magazines painted a picture of a flawless manufacturing juggernaut. However, sustaining the title of America's most admired company required a hidden, staggering toll. The relentless executive mandate to introduce 365 new products a year had transformed the sprawling Wooster complex into an oppressive, localized industrial inferno. The golden age of hyperscale was entirely dependent on a brutal, physical reality that remained invisible to the consumer and the shareholder. Operating a 1,000,000-square-foot plastics plant 24 hours a day generated an immense environmental footprint. The transition to high-density polyethylene and complex polymers had sterilized the factory of the old rubber soot, but it replaced it with a pervasive, synthetic atmosphere. Inside the massive warehouses, the ambient temperature near the heavy injection molding presses frequently soared to punishing extremes, especially during the humid midwestern summers. These machines operated by melting raw plastic resin at temperatures exceeding 400 degrees Fahrenheit before forcing it into chilled steel molds under thousands of tons of pressure. This continuous thermal cycling released a constant, heavy ease of chemical off-gassing into the factory air. Despite towering industrial ventilation systems, a distinct, sweet, and acrid smell of heated polymers settled permanently over the facility and drifted across the surrounding neighborhoods of Wayne County. A fine, almost imperceptible layer of raw resin dust coated the catwalks, the loading docks, and the vehicles in the employee parking lots. Furthermore, the sheer velocity of the daily quota generated an unprecedented volume of industrial waste. Prototyping a new product every single day meant an endless cycle of trial and error on an industrial scale. Massive multi-ton steel molds were frequently tested, modified, and scrapped. When a production line required a color change from forest green to colonial blue, the massive heated barrels of the injection presses had to be completely purged of the old plastic. This process generated massive hardened chunks of unusable mixed color resin known as purge blocks. These heavy blocks, along with thousands of rejected prototypes and flawed units, piled up in sprawling fenced scrapyards behind the main facility. A physical testament to the friction of relentless innovation. Inside the plant, the human cost of this volume was becoming severe. The fierce pride and generational loyalty that had defined the Wooster workforce in previous decades was systematically weaponized against them. The algorithmic efficiency that now governed the factory floor stripped away the autonomy and craftsmanship of the individual worker. The colossal machines dictated the pace, and the pace was accelerating. To meet the soaring production targets and clear the massive backlog of new product launches, factory management implemented aggressive schedules of mandatory overtime. The standard 8-hour shift evaporated. Workers were routinely required to pull 12-hour rotations, sometimes working 6 or 7 consecutive days. The physical toll of standing on concrete floors, managing the continuous output of scalding hot plastic, and keeping pace with the unyielding mechanical rhythm began to break the labor force. Chronic fatigue set in across the community. Repetitive stress injuries spiked, and the sheer exhaustion of the workforce led to an increase in industrial accidents near the heavy presses. The symbiotic relationship between the company and the town had mutated into a form of golden handcuffs. The workforce was highly compensated, and their pensions were deeply tied to the soaring stock price of the company, making it financially ruinous for any individual to walk away. Fathers who had proudly brought their sons onto the factory floor now watched them burn out under the crushing weight of the corporate quota. The community of Wooster remained wealthy, but it was fundamentally exhausted, running a marathon at a sprint pace just to keep the machines fed and Wall Street satisfied. Yet, the most dangerous consequence of this era was not the environmental degradation or the physical exhaustion of the workforce. It was a massive systemic blind spot developing within the executive leadership. The corporate offices were entirely focused on the velocity of production, celebrating the sheer number of units rolling off the assembly lines. They were creating an ocean of plastic, but they were rapidly running out of places to put it. The physical reality of manufacturing millions of bulky items like outdoor sheds, heavy-duty trash cans, and industrial mop buckets meant that the company required an astronomical amount of storage and transportation infrastructure. The warehouses in Ohio, despite continuous expansion, were bursting. The traditional network of regional hardware stores and independent pharmacies could only absorb a fraction of this output. The factory was choking on its own phenomenal success. This logistical nightmare forced a climactic strategic pivot that would alter the destiny of the entire empire. To relieve the massive inventory pressure, executive leadership realized they had to bypass the fractured, traditional retail market and secure massive, guaranteed volume contracts. They turned their attention to a new, rapidly expanding phenomenon in the American economy: the big box mega retailer. Companies operating massive warehouse-style stores possessed the necessary square footage to display the sprawling Rubbermaid catalog, and more importantly, they possessed the national logistics networks to absorb the millions of units pouring out of Wayne County. The executives aggressively courted these retail giants, securing massive contracts to supply their rapidly multiplying locations across the continent. In the short term, this decision appeared to be a masterstroke of corporate synergy. The big box stores swallowed the excess inventory, the factory machines kept roaring, and the stock price continued its upward trajectory. However, the executives had fundamentally miscalculated the power dynamic of this new arrangement. By tying their colossal production capacity to a handful of massive retail chains, Rubbermaid quietly surrendered its autonomy. They had transitioned from a diversified manufacturer selling to thousands of small, dependent clients into a captive supplier completely reliant on a few massive distributors to survive. The factory that had proudly dominated its industry, crushed its early competitors, and built an entire midwestern city was now heavily dependent on retailers whose sole corporate objective was to drive supplier prices into the ground. The trap was fully set. The workforce was exhausted. The factory was running at maximum capacity with no margin for error. And the keys to the empire had been handed over to the mega retailers, completely setting the stage for a devastating standoff. The massive industrial ecosystem constructed in Wayne County operated on a razor-thin margin of error. It required a constant, uninterrupted flow of raw materials in and a massive, continuous outflow of finished consumer goods. By the mid-1990s, the executive leadership in Ohio had successfully tied this colossal output to the sprawling logistics networks of the big box mega retailers. The most critical of these relationships was forged with Walmart, a rapidly expanding retail empire headquartered in Bentonville, Arkansas. This singular corporate entity was absorbing a staggering percentage of the total production volume from the Wooster facility. For a brief period, the alliance appeared highly lucrative, but it fundamentally exposed the manufacturing giant to global macroeconomic forces it could no longer control. The catalyst for the collapse arrived not from a failure of engineering or a shift in consumer taste, but from the volatile global commodities market. In late 1994, the global petrochemical supply chain experienced severe and unexpected turbulence. The cost of raw, high-density polyethylene resin, the absolute lifeblood of the entire Rubbermaid operation, spiked exponentially. Within a matter of months, the base east of the chemical compounds required to mold the heavy-duty outdoor sheds, refuse containers, and kitchen storage units nearly doubled. This macroeconomic shock instantly threatened the foundational strategy of the Wooster complex. For decades, the company had strictly refused to compromise on material quality, deliberately choosing to utilize premium, thick-walled plastics to ensure indestructibility. In a stable commodities market, this premium quality justified a premium retail price. But with the cost of raw resin skyrocketing, the profit margins that had fueled the hyperscale expansion of the 1980s began to evaporate overnight. The executives in Ohio realized they could no longer absorb the manufacturing costs. To survive the spike in resin prices, they had to pass the cost along to the consumer. Armed with their reputation as the most admired company in America, Rubbermaid leadership approached their largest buyer. They initiated negotiations with Walmart to secure a necessary price increase across their entire product catalog. The executives operating out of Wayne County genuinely believed their immense brand equity and their history of flawless consumer trust provided them with the necessary leverage to dictate pricing. They fundamentally misunderstood the operational philosophy of their distributor. Walmart was not a traditional retail partner. It was a highly aggressive logistical machine built entirely on the mandate of everyday low prices. The corporate culture in Bentonville dictated that the retailer, possessing the ultimate access to the consumer base, controlled the market entirely. When Rubbermaid presented their demand for a price increase to cover the raw material spike, Walmart executives flatly refused. They would not accept a single cent in price hikes. This confrontation resulted in a catastrophic standoff. It was a collision of two entirely different economic models. Rubbermaid represented the traditional American manufacturing ideal, where physical quality and production costs dictated the final value. Walmart represented the new era of globalized retail, where the distributor dictated the maximum allowable price, and the manufacturer was expected to absorb the losses or engineer a cheaper product. When Rubbermaid attempted to hold their ground, believing their products were too essential to be abandoned, the retail giant executed a ruthless and immediate countermeasure. Walmart possessed total control over the physical retail space, and they used it as a weapon. They aggressively punished the Ohio manufacturer by immediately stripping Rubbermaid products from highly visible end cap displays and premium shelving locations across thousands of stores. In their place, Walmart buyers rapidly sourced vast quantities of cheaper, thinner, and highly inferior plastic goods from overseas manufacturers who were willing to operate on microscopic margins. The premium Rubbermaid items were relegated to the bottom shelves, hidden behind columns, or entirely discontinued from the inventory system. The physical consequences of this punishment hit the Wayne County facility with the force of an industrial earthquake. The massive distribution pipeline, which had required the factory to run 24 hours a day to keep full, was suddenly pinched shut. Millions of finished units, molded with expensive raw resin, sat unshipped in the sprawling Ohio warehouses. For the first time in over half a century, the relentless, deafening roar of the injection molding machines began to falter. The deep, rhythmic thud of the steel presses slowed. The massive silos towering over the facility remained full of raw plastic, drawing no vacuum. The mandatory overtime schedules that had severely exhausted the local workforce were abruptly canceled. This sudden operational deceleration sent a shockwave of terror through the community. The generational workforce, who had spent decades believing that the sheer physical mass of their factory made them invincible, watched in disbelief as the unstoppable behemoth began to choke on its own stagnant inventory. Shift hours were drastically cut, and the parking lots that had been full around the clock began to empty. The financial markets reacted to the standoff with brutal efficiency. Without the massive volume of the Walmart distribution network, the revenue stream of the company collapsed. The staggering profit margins that had defined the golden age vanished. The stock price, which had split repeatedly and funded the retirements of thousands of Ohio families, plummeted in a matter of months. Wall Street analysts rapidly downgraded the corporate outlook, violently stripping the company of its prestigious titles. The executive leadership in Wooster panicked. They had scaled the physical factory to such a colossal size that it required maximum, uninterrupted output simply to service its own debt and operating costs. By losing the standoff with their primary distributor, they had completely lost control of their own survival. Hemorrhaging capital and operating a massive, underutilized manufacturing complex, the once mighty industrial titan became highly vulnerable. In 1999, the inevitable culmination of this death spiral arrived. The weakened, bleeding empire was targeted for corporate consolidation. Rubbermaid was acquired by the Newell Company, a massive holding conglomerate specializing in absorbing and restructuring consumer brands. The merger formed a new entity, Newell Rubbermaid, but it was a merger in name only. It was a humiliating takeover of a weakened manufacturer by a financial operator. This acquisition marked the permanent transfer of power away from Wayne County. The Newell executives were not manufacturers rooted in the midwestern soil. They were financial engineers headquartered in Illinois, tasked with ruthless cost-cutting and an asset liquidation. They possessed absolutely no loyalty to the town of Wooster, no reverence for the heavy steel injection molds, and no attachment to the generational workforce that had built the empire. The American manufacturer had been systematically broken by the American distributor, and the sprawling factory complex was now entirely exposed to the cold, unforgiving mathematics of globalized retail. Following the 1999 acquisition, the operational reality within the Wayne County complex underwent a radical and terminal transformation. The new corporate executives from the Newell Company arrived in Ohio with an entirely different economic vocabulary. They were not manufacturers rooted in the heavy industrial traditions of the Midwest. They were financial engineers operating out of Illinois, and their primary mandate was the ruthless maximization of a shareholder value through corporate consolidation. When these executives surveyed the million-square-foot Rubbermaid facility, they did not see a triumphant monument to American craftsmanship or a vital community ecosystem. They saw an intolerable overhead expense. The sprawling plant had been meticulously engineered to sustain continuous, hyper-scaled output. It required a massive workforce, complex logistics, and an enormous consumption of raw energy just to maintain baseline operations. This physical reality was fundamentally incompatible with the new corporate strategy, which was heavily focused on aggressive cost reduction, stripping away localized infrastructure, and utilizing cheaper offshore manufacturing to appease the relentless pricing demands of the global retail market. The factory that had built the city of Wooster was no longer viewed as an asset. It was actively managed as a liability on a spreadsheet. The mathematical conclusion of this financial strategy was formally executed in late 2003. Newell Rubbermaid executives announced the total cessation of all manufacturing operations at the Wooster facility. The communication of this decision was delivered with absolute corporate detachment. There were no negotiations, no appeals to the generational loyalty of the workforce, and no considerations for the municipal infrastructure that had been entirely built upon the tax revenue of the factory. The production lines were ordered to be permanently dismantled. The work was to be distributed to non-union facilities and overseas contractors who were capable of operating within the microscopic profit margins dictated by the big box distributors. The decommissioning of the industrial behemoth was a methodical, deeply clinical autopsy of an empire. Over the course of several months, the massive injection molding presses that had operated continuously for decades were systematically powered down. They were unbolted from their deep reinforced concrete foundations, hoisted onto heavy transport vehicles, and sold off to the highest bidder or shipped out of the region. The towering aluminum silos that had once held thousands of tons of volatile plastic resin were drained and left completely hollow. The climactic moment of the collapse and the defining trauma for the region occurred on the day the final shift officially ended. For nearly a century, the deep, resonant blast of the factory shift whistle had served as the metronome for Wayne County. It had dictated the rhythm of local traffic, the operating hours of downtown businesses, and the daily routines of thousands of families. When that whistle sounded for the final time, echoing across the valley and fading into the overcast midwestern sky, it was followed by an unnatural, permanent silence. The constant, vibrating hum of heavy machinery that had permeated the ground of the surrounding neighborhood ceased entirely. the heartbeat of the city simply stopped. The physical decay of the site was immediate and profound. The sprawling complex rapidly transitioned from a vibrant epicenter of American manufacturing into a colossal industrial tomb. The vast employee parking lots, which had previously required complex logistical management and dedicated traffic signals to handle the staggered shifts of the massive workforce, sat entirely empty. Without the daily friction of thousands of vehicles, the massive expanses of asphalt quickly gave way to aggressive seasonal weeds and deep structural cracks. Deep inside the darkened warehouses, the remnants of the operation were left to succumb to the elements. The heavy steel molds, once guarded as the highly engineered proprietary lifeblood of the company, oxidized and rusted in the humid midwestern air. The intricate infrastructure of the Golden Age, the sprawling networks of pneumatic resin tubes, the massive industrial chilling systems, and the miles of automated conveyor belts became nothing more than a silent monument to a vanished era. The brightly colored plastic that had defined the modern American home was replaced entirely by the muted tones of oxidized iron and peeling lead paint. Beyond the chain-link fences, the economic crater left by the closure devastated the city of Wooster. The impact extended far beyond the immediate termination of over 1,000 manufacturing jobs. The generational wealth of the entire community had been deeply and fatally tethered to the corporate entity. As the original stock value had plummeted during the retail standoff of the late 1990s, and the new corporate ownership aggressively restructured the remaining financial assets, the robust pensions that had promised secure retirements for the local workforce severely degraded or evaporated entirely. The secondary economy of Wayne County collapsed in rapid sequence. Local diners, hardware stores, and service industries that had thrived for decades on the continuous, reliable payroll of the factory were forced into bankruptcy. The civic infrastructure, previously underwritten by heavy corporate philanthropy and massive tax revenues, faced severe and immediate budget deficits. However, the psychological damage inflicted upon the community was arguably more profound than the financial ruin. The fierce, impenetrable pride of the workforce, built upon the deeply held belief that their localized craftsmanship and sheer industrial scale made them invincible, was entirely shattered. The workers of Wayne County had executed their jobs perfectly. They had engineered indestructible products, they had built the most admired company in the nation, and they had dominated their industry for decades. Yet despite their flawless execution, they had still been systematically erased. They were forced to reconcile with the terrifying reality that their specialized knowledge and physical labor no longer held any intrinsic value in the modern economy. The timeline of the Wooster facility serves as a grim, definitive record of a fundamental structural shift in American capitalism. The fall of the Rubbermaid empire was not an isolated incident of poor local management or shifting consumer tastes. It was the exact historical moment the balance of power permanently transferred across the economic landscape. For the first 3/4 of the 20th century, the entities that manufactured physical good held the ultimate leverage. The manufacturer dictated the quality of the materials, they set the pace of industrial innovation, and they established the final value of the product. The workforce in Wayne County represented the absolute peak of this paradigm. James Caldwell had built the foundation by demanding a better, indestructible dustpan, and the market had rewarded that pursuit of physical quality. However, the catastrophic standoff over a simple plastic trash can revealed that the era of the manufacturer had definitively ended. The leverage had transitioned entirely away from the people who made things, landing firmly in the hands of the mega-corporations that controlled the distribution channels. When the sprawling Ohio factory was forced into submission by the relentless pricing demands of the global megastore, it established a brutal new precedent. The institutions that created physical value were now entirely subservient to the institutions that moved it. The mandate was no longer to build the best possible product. The mandate was to build the cheapest possible product to satisfy the algorithmic pricing models of the distributor. In this new, ruthless economic reality, the distributor emerged as the undisputed titan, while the American industrial town, stripped of its leverage and left with nothing but silent machines and empty warehouses, paid the ultimate devastating price. The rusted gates of the Wooster plant are permanently closed, but the machinery of modern retail continues to accelerate. Looking back at this industrial tragedy, do you believe Rubbermaid could have survived if they refused to partner with the mega retailers? Or was their submission to Walmart mathematically inevitable? Let me know your perspective in the comments below. If you appreciate these detailed explorations into the rise and fall of America's greatest manufacturing empires, please consider subscribing to the channel. Until next time, thank you for watching.